What's going on, everyone? Wassu here. Hope everyone's having a good summer. Just wanted to take you through the project Andu and specifically my Mixdown process. Last time in Krasboruch, we talked a little bit more about concepts around arrangement, idea generation, and the like. This time, I kind of want to dive more into detail about my mixing process, specifically on the channels, as well as my bus mixdown process. So before we dive right in, why don't we take a few seconds to sort of hear what the track sounds like. So that is the lead track of the EP, Andu. Just came out a couple weeks ago on Friday, July 10th with When We Dip's brand new Tales of Romance label. The first thing that I really sort of wanted to take the opportunity to talk about is really just the concept of channel processing and mixing. So some people approach this in different ways where they sort of have, I guess, their creative sessions where they're not really worried about mixing and they're not really thinking about sort of how all the channels sound individually together at the same time. For me personally, I really try to sort of mix things as I go. And then later on, maybe there's like a separate, call it 45-minute or 1-hour session where I do my actual bus mixdown process. So this is kind of like the icing of the cake, if you will, as it relates to my mixdown. So I think basic concepts, first and foremost, as it relates to your musical channels, obviously EQing out everything in the low end, like you can see, for instance, in this guitar ambience that I have. If I go ahead and solo it, you can see I'm cutting out a lot of the noise, but below, call it 150, 160 hertz. And other things that are really sort of, I wouldn't say intuitive, but things that I'm really kind of doing out of the gate are my low end elements. So specifically my sub bass or my kick drum. All that I'm really doing down here is I simply have a utility on the channel here and I have mono clicked on. So basically just puts everything in mono, and that allows for more space for some other musical elements to really breathe in the mix. Same thing with my kick drum. Almost always have it in mono as well. When I talk about mixing as I go, it really relates to sort of those basic processes around like EQing, putting things in mono, side chaining, and the like. So one thing that I was initially doing for the last, call it year or 2 years, was throwing on shaper box on all of my individual channels. So like my music, my hats, my drums. Now I am actually side chaining the entire music bus. So if you look up here, here's like this little arpeggiator that I have that you can kind of hear throughout the track. I'll solo it so you can hear what it sounds like. Right, so initially what I was doing, going back to my concept, was putting shaper box directly on the channel. This is my music bus over here, and you can kind of see and hear what all of those elements sound like together. And I think even with the ARP down here as well. So what I'm doing now is I actually have a compressor on the channel to sort of glue all the elements together. Pretty standard sort of settings. Have a pretty medium-sized attack to a quick release so that everything is kind of glued together nicely. But going back to the concept of shaper box, I'm literally side chaining all of my musical elements together on the same bus. So what I'm doing here is, if I look at my low end, for instance, I actually have it automated as well, so that when the kick comes out, it's actually at 0, so you don't get that really pumping effect. But if I keep playing it into the first sort of verse here, see it's automating up and up. Okay, so here's what's going on here. So basically what I've done is I've thrown shaper box, as I've mentioned a billion times already, on the music bus, and I'm splitting the bands. So what I've done here is I'm splitting the band, the low band, at about 435 hertz, and I'm side chaining all of that information below 435 hertz at 100%. So basically that's kind of where I see, call it like 400, 500 hertz, where I feel like the low end, the sub, and the kick drum are already sort of taking up that space anyway. So even though I'm side chaining that band, call it 100%, it may seem aggressive, but your low end and your kick drum are sort of filling that space anyway, so you're not really going to tell. It's just going to allow for that much more room in your mix down process, if you will, as well. And then typically what I'm doing up here, in this case, it doesn't look like I've side chained the sort of medium to high band up at all. But usually what I'm doing is I'll split the band at again, like 430 hertz, and I'll sidechain that maybe 35 to 40%. Again, it's very minimal, but it just gives that much more room for the kick and the low end to sort of breathe, if you will. So that's something that I actually just recently switched up, call it in the last 4 or 5 months, and I think it's really important, and it allows me to sort of have more room for loudness when it comes to the mix down and pre-master process as well. So with that, why don't we sort of, I think that's a nice segue into, call it my bus mixdown process. So again, I'm typically kind of doing stuff as I go on individual channels, whether it's like low shelving something, doing like a high cut on my musical elements to allow for my hi-hats to breathe, for example. And then once I sort of have the mix, call it 75 to 80% of the way there, the composition, by the way, is done at this point. That's when I sort of sit down and I say, okay, let's group all the music together. Let's group all the drums together, the effects, vocals if I have any, and sort of bus process them from there. So while we're on the music bus, why don't we start with that? We talked briefly about the compressor before as well. So you can see I have sort of a threshold. Nothing crazy here. I'm just really trying to look for, call it anywhere from 2 to 4 dB of gain reduction. So you can kind of see, even then, yeah, see like 3 to 4 dB of gain reduction. And then after that, another brand new thing that I'm really doing as well, in addition to channel EQing, is I'm also doing an EQ on the music bus as well. And I was actually pretty sparing with this. I think recently I find myself going up to as much as even like 300 hertz on the music bus. And again, that's just kind of EQing everything out, all that information out in the low end, to allow for just sort of a cleaner mix and a little bit more separation between your low end elements, your musical elements, and then your drums and your top end elements as well. So if you can kind of see what that looks like in here. So like if I bypass it, it still sounds okay, but it just doesn't, when I put it on, it just creates that much more room and that much more depth in the mix. And that's really it. And we talked about Shaper Box before as it relates to the music channel. The next thing, and something that I've been doing for really call it the last 2 years or so, is the concept of parallel compression when it relates to your drums. So what I actually do here is I color my drums, as we talked about last time, my claps, my kick drums, usually blue. And then what I'll do with my hi-hats is I'll have them in yellow, and then my congas and stuff like that, like a lighter, sort of lighter brown or darker brown and whatnot. So if I solo, if I go up here, you can see I have a full send up here. So this is kind of my drum bus. Let's just solo it so you can hear what it sounds like. Let's go ahead to the drop. You can barely hear it, and the reason why is I've actually lowered that specific bus by about 21 dB. And what I'm doing, I have everything routed to that specific bus, including the kick drum. And what I've done is I've actually thrown on Soundtoys Devil Locks Deluxe. And what this is, it has a compressor built in, but it's really aggressive. But it allows for the drums to kind of poke out more in the mix rather than just like a standard compressor. And so you'll see here I have a crush of about 4.5, a crunch of about 2 or so. And so if I had this bus all the way up to 0 dB, it would sound totally distorted. It would sound completely breaking up and whatnot. But here in this case, what I'm really doing is I'm lowering that bus, call it by 21, 22 dB or so, to sort of compensate for that effect. And then after that as well, I actually also have an EQ. And the EQ, what it's doing here, it's actually cleaning up the low end as it relates to the kick drum. Because remember, we have the kick drum specifically on that bus as well. So if I were to bypass this, your sub is going to distort. So if I go ahead and do that, I don't know if you can hear it, but the kick is really breaking up, and it doesn't sound good. So that's kind of what the EQ is doing up here as well. And the reason why I have a full send is I have this routed to my drum filter bus, and all this really is for parts like, for example, in the breakdown, if, again, this is not really a mixing thing, but I'm just lowering the gain. I'm maybe doing some filtering as well, as you can see up here in the track later on in the song. So yeah, that's really it for drums. I almost always just have that Devil Lock Deluxe plugin on. It's an incredible plugin by Soundtoys, and it just really allows for the drums to sound sharper, more sort of polished in the mix, as opposed to just kind of being flat. So why don't I try and play the song out with it on, and then bypass it so you can hopefully sort of hear what it sounds like. Again, it's really subtle. It's extremely subtle. And the reason being is because we have that bus lowered down by about negative 21 dB or so. It's very subtle, but that's what mixing is, really. You're just doing subtle processing to sort of allow things to stand out. And then once you combine all of those things together at once in the project, that's what separates a track from sounding like it was made in a bedroom versus made in a professional studio, if that makes sense. That's my thought process, at least anyway. Next thing I want to cover is, again, my effects bus. Really simple stuff up here. This is kind of for my risers, my downlifters, my reverse crashes, even like my ambiances as well, so like my field recordings and whatnot. So if I go up here to this effects riser, you can see pretty simple processing. The one thing that I think is a bit nuanced is specifically this BBE sound plugin, which I also use on my kick bass bus as well, which we'll cover next. This just brings a lot more air to your effects, really. So if I go ahead and solo my effects bus up here, I don't know what it does, to be honest, but it just brings so much more life to your effects. And you can kind of tweak with the process knob here, and that kind of allows you to dial in how much air you want to add to your effects. So I'm using this on all of my effects buses, period. And that's it for effects, really. Just, again, I think the biggest thing as it relates to your music buses and your effects buses is just compression. I think that's a big sort of, and again, you can just see that I'm using the stock plugin by Logic, the stock compressor. And the purpose of that is to just kind of put everything more or less in the same space. That's what I think makes compression so powerful. And then lastly, what I also want to cover, arguably the most important bus, is my kick bass bus. And again, no surprise there. There is also a compressor on that. So let's go ahead and solo my kick bass bus. So again, in this case, again, this is a little bit nuanced, but in this case, I'm really looking at -2 to -3 dB of gain reduction. I think nowadays I would probably compress a little bit less. I think what's nice about compressing your kick bass bus is that, again, it puts the two elements kind of working in the same space, but you have to be careful because I feel like, personally for me, I really like a lot of body to my kick drums and a lot of sort of that subby low-end warmth that you get, specifically in the deep house and the progressive house, the slower BPM scene, if you will. So the more that you're going to compress something, the more gain reduction that you're getting out of your compressor, what's happening is you are essentially bringing out the attack of your kick drum, and then you are compromising by shaving off some of your low-end body to that sub part of your kick. So be careful with this. Again, I think for me, 1 to 2 dB is roughly the sweet spot, but not all kick-bass relationships are equal, so it really kind of depends on the track. There's actually one tutorial that I watched through Tim Green's Making You Transition session earlier in the year, and I think one of the biggest things that he mentions is it's not necessarily the kicks that I'm using. It's more about really kind of the way that I'm mixing them. And this is like a pure example of that, right? So like if I remove the Devil Lock on the drum bus, if I remove the compression that you're seeing on this kick bass bus here as well, if I remove the EQ, there's even some EQ on that kick drum as well, it's gonna sound completely different, right? And I think simple things like tuning your kicks to the root key of the song, in addition to sort of your bus processing, your processing of your bass line, saturation, no saturation, all of that is going to play a role in terms of like how your kick drum is sitting in the mix. And then lastly, similar to the other BBE sound plugin that we were looking at on the effects bus, this is the harmonic maximizer. It's really something that just brings in a lot more warmth and sort of drive and even some sort of coloring on a saturation level to your kick bass bus. So if I go ahead and play this, I'm going to bypass it real quick. It just really brings that sort of low-end sub to the front of the mix and just allows it to sort of punch through the monitors, headphones, and whatnot that much more. And so, yeah, that's really kind of it as it relates to my bus mixdown processing. Other things that I wanted to sort of highlight up here as well is if I'm feeling really lazy and I'm trying to take out some resonances or harsh frequencies in a specific channel or even just a bus, there is this incredible plugin. Again, this is, I guess, my secret tip of the day. It's called Soothe by OEK Sound. And basically what it is, it's a dynamic EQ. It's not a multi-band compressor, but it's not an EQ. But I think the best way to describe it is a dynamic EQ. So if I go ahead and solo this channel up here, so you can see it's identifying algorithmically those harsh frequencies, and then you can sort of identify via this depth knob up here how much you're going to tuck out of that specific frequency. So if I go ahead and bypass it, it's pretty harsh. Let me just go back again so we can hear it. I can already hear the resonances just sort of be a bit piercing. And then once I throw this on, it just takes care of that right for me. So I think that's another thing as well. If I can simply identify where that is, you know, kind of via the seek and destroy method, as it relates to just manual EQ, I'll do that. But if it's something as complex as kind of like a spaced out guitar-like ambience where there's kind of a bunch of different frequencies hitting across the spectrum, honestly, I just throw this thing on, dial it in, problem solved. So yeah, I think that's really it as it relates to my mixdown processes. Again, nothing too complicated. I think one thing that's really important for me is, again, sort of getting the mix 75 to 80% of the way there, and then saving a separate session to sort of tidy up some loose ends as it relates to my bus mixdown processes. So again, yeah, hopefully you enjoyed this video. Hope it was informative. As always, if you have any questions, just feel free to DM me, email me, get in touch with me via Facebook. I'm always happy to help and always happy to be a resource. So happy producing and hope to see you guys soon.